This is the fourth and final part for Chapter 2 video lesson. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about chemical reactions and try to relate it as best as we can to biology, since you're taking chemistry or have already taken chemistry as a prerequisite for this class. So as you may already know, chemical reactions make and break chemical bonds. We've just been talking about the different kinds of chemical bonds. So anytime there's a change in those chemical bonds or new bonds being made, that's a chemical reaction. And these chemical reactions can lead to new arrangements of atoms. The molecules that are starting off a chemical reaction, what goes into those reactions are called reactants. The molecules that come out after the chemical reaction are called the products. So to further investigate this, let's look at a very important example of a chemical reaction we'll study in this course, which is photosynthesis. As shown at the bottom here, with the reaction for photosynthesis, we have the reactants of carbon dioxide and water. And through the reaction involving energy from light, those reactants, the atoms are rearranged to form the products, which are glucose, which is the food for the plant, and oxygen, which is a byproduct of photosynthesis, but a beneficial thing that's produced for the atmosphere. But for plants, it's really all about the glucose. And again, we'll study this later in more depth when it comes to the photosynthesis chapter. Another important reaction in biology is the dissociation of water. Or another name for this process is the self-ionization of water because, excuse me, water, H2O, can actually lose a proton, as shown here in the reactants shown. The second water molecule is giving away a proton to another water molecule. So the result of this, the products, would be H3O plus, which is called hydronium, and hydroxyl, OH minus. Now this can also be simplified as H2O breaking into protons or H plus and OH negative or hydroxyl. This reaction the way that water can dissociate in a solution can influence a chemical property of the water known as pH. And it specifically has to do with the concentration of the hydroxide ions and hydrogen ions, and hydroxide ions. pH is the property that is determined by the concentration of protons in an aqueous solution. In fact, pH stands for potential of hydrogen. The pH scale ranges from 0 to 14, where any substance with a pH less than 7, from 0 to 7, would be considered an acid, and anything with a pH from up to 14, from 7 to 14, not including 7, because that would be neutral, but anything greater than 7 would be a base. Now, whether a substance is an acid or a base, what it really comes down to is the concentration of the hydrogen ions compared to the hydroxide ions. In an acid, there's a greater concentration of hydrogen ions compared to hydroxide ions. In a base, it's reversed. And in a neutral substance with pH 7, they're equal. When this occurs in an aqueous solution, there's a reaction that happens. Acids would be split apart in water, and that's how the hydrogen ions would be released. Bases, on the other hand, when they're mixed with water, release the hydroxide ions. So as shown in the little beaker illustrations on the right, if you add acid to water, you see water still there because it's an aqueous solution, but also these hydrogen ions. And in the base, when you add that to water, you get the hydroxide ions. So make sure you understand the definition of an acid and a base, which is here, but also the relationship between the concentration of the hydrogen ions and pH, which it's an inverse relationship. Acids have a high concentration of hydrogen ions and a low pH, while bases have a low concentration of hydrogen ions and a high pH. Now, if you recall, the pH scale ranges from 0 to 14. And so anything with pH greater than 7 is base, anything with pH less than 7 is an acid. So there are different kinds of acids and base based on where they fall on the pH scale. A strong acid would have the lowest pH, lower pH than a weak acid. And what's actually happening is when the acid is mixed with water, a strong acid is going to release a larger number of the hydrogen ions, thus making it more acidic and lowering the pH. And you can see that in the beaker on the left. The hydrogen ions or protons are the little white dots, and they're basically all separated from the acid that was originally added to the beaker. Whereas in the weak acid, it's kind of a mixture. You have some of them that are still attached, some are still in the form of the acid, and some of the protons have dissociated. Similar thing happens with strong and weak bases. So a strong base, which is going to have a higher pH, closer to 14, would fully dissociate in water, releasing all of its hydroxide ions. Versus a weak base would not fully dissociate in water. Maybe some of them would remain as bases, and some would dissociate. And they would have a pH that would be closer to 7. So anytime you have a weak acid or a weak base, they're going to have a pH that's closer, but not equal to 7, than one of the stronger acids and bases that would be either closer to 0 for acid or closer to 14 for a base. So we'll be applying the property of pH when we talk about things like photosynthesis and cell respiration involving the movement of protons across membranes, how that affects the pH environment of those spaces, and also on a bigger scale, how pH is important for living things, because some parts of living things need to have a particular pH to operate appropriately, like our blood, for example, or even the water that an organism lives in has to be an appropriate pH for those aquatic organisms, like corals that are not able to survive if the oceans become too acidic. Many of these corals are dying because they can't tolerate the low pH. So there's a lot of applications to biology for these topics that we'll discuss further in this class.